These are children. These are babies that need to grow up. And sad to say, as preachers, we haven't helped them to grow because we've just given them bad news. And so no wonder church is boring to them. Another text that was given to us is in Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 26. Deuteronomy chapter 33, verse 26. There is none like unto the God of Jeshurun, who rideth upon the heaven in thy help, and in his excellency on the sky. Who is Jeshurun? Who is Jeshurun? It's a political title, it's a poetical title for the people of Israel. And it actually has the sense of the upright ones, the chosen, the righteous. And it is a pet name. The dear little people, the good little people. There is none like unto the God of the good little people. You remember how Jesus used to call his followers little children? Little children? Yeah. It's kind of got that connotation to it. It's like a pet name. Do you have a pet name for family members? Yeah. Do you have a pet name for your mother or your father? You know, it's a very endearing, intimate, close. Nobody else hardly knows about it but the two of you, you know, or your family members. Jeshurun, it's hard to pronounce, but that was God's pet name for Israel. Oh. The little children. The good little people is what it means. Jeshurun. And or the chosen ones. And who is Israel? Well, Jacob was Israel. Well, he was one of them, and he was one of the most deceptive, selfish, thieving rats. But he was chosen from birth. And he eventually, the Lord renamed him as Israel, which means an overcomer. He overcame his thieving, deceptive, rascally character. And he was chosen from birth. He had such a terrible bad record, but the Lord's love won his heart. Any of you have a bad record? Yeah. I got a bad record. I got a bad record. And yet God has chosen you from your birth. You're his little child. From the very first, God has looked upon you as the good little people. And if you don't hinder him, he will draw you and change your life and transform you by his love. We have another story in our lesson about worship, and that is Hannah in the Old Testament. You remember Hannah? Who is she famous for? Huh? Samuel. That's right. We think of Samuel. We had this in our lesson a couple of quarters ago. And at that time, I learned to really appreciate Hannah. Because we have a story in the Old Testament that shows a man offering his son as a sacrifice to God. He made the choice, Abraham, didn't he, to take the life of his son, at whose command? God commanded him to do that. And that was a revelation in the Old Testament, a landmark revelation of how God gave his only begotten son. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. Abraham and Isaac are the illustration of John 3:16 in the Old Testament. But Hannah is the female version of the same. And so for me, I give high praise to Hannah because she prayed for that boy, Samuel. She named him Asked of God. That's what Samuel means, ask of God. And then in his babyhood, she gave him back to God and left him. That was a supreme act of worship on her part. It was a supreme sacrifice for that mother to give her child to God, to give him back to God because he was asked of God. To me, Hannah gets high praise, and she stands on a level with Abraham and Isaac in the Old Testament. You remember that Hannah went through terrible circumstances before she had Samuel. She was barren, and in those days, to be without child was a real, well, how would you say it? Anyhow, it was a social stigma attached to it. What did you say? Can't hear. Disgrace. It was a disgrace not to be able to bear children. And especially a son. And the state of the church in Hannah's day was pathetic. The priests and Eli and his sons, they were corrupt. It was so bad that women were molested at the temple. And Elkanah, the husband of Hannah, was a priest in waiting, and he didn't have a son by his first wife, Hannah, and so he chose the route of bigamy, to marry another woman in order to get a son. Imagine that. The state of the church was pathetic. Priests having a couple of wives. And Hannah is barren. She wants children. And so they go up to worship at the annual feast season. It was comparable to our camp meetings. And these feasts provided times for family worship of God. So when they went to the temple at Bethel, they were worshiping God. And there were supposed to be times of refreshment and joy. There was feasting and drinking. Hannah is barren, a barren woman who is loved, and a fertile woman who is not. The fertile woman, this is, by the way, in 1 Samuel chapter 1 and verse 6. And Penina was the fertile woman, and she taunted and provoked Hannah with the reproach that God had caused her barrenness, just like Hagar had treated Sarah in her barrenness. And that can generate a spirit of persecution within a family system. Can you imagine that family? Boy, I tell you, Elkanah had problems on his hands with these two women. And instead of venting her feelings on Penina, Hannah turns inward. She becomes silent. She hides herself in grief. Hannah experiences the pain of persistent childlessness. Elkanah knows the cause of her pain. And yet, in his crass insensitivity, he says to her, Oh, Hannah, don't worry, that it's okay if you don't give me any children. I'm just like 10 to you. The guy's full of himself. Arrogant, really comes across not really understanding the feelings of Hannah. So she's not able to get any sympathy or help from her husband, so she turns to the only one who can surely understand and who can give her children. Who does Hannah turn to? She turns to God. And she's the only woman in the entire Bible to utter a formal prayer and have it recorded in the Bible. So she breaks her silence, and she now gives voice throughout the rest of her story. Her prayer request is very specific in requesting a son. And yet it is extremely a self-sacrificing vow, because it reveals that she understands the very heart of God, who gave his only begotten Son for the world. She most desires a son, verse 11, not for herself, but for the vindication of God. Because in verse 11 she says she will give the son to God forever. Lord, I pray for a son. And when you give me a son, I vow that I'm going to give that son back to you. Now, God hears a self-sacrificing prayer like that. God hears a self-sacrificing. Most of my prayers are gimme, 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 gimme. God, you're such a wonderful Santa Claus. Here's my whole list. And I never think about him and never think about his needs. and his vindication. But here is Hannah, who is now beginning to appreciate God's self-sacrificing love, and she's thinking about him. Maybe she's thinking, oh, the state of the church is so pathetic these days. I want to make my little contribution to help it. I will give you my son.
You wouldn't consider that an Old Covenant prayer?
A vow?
Is that a vow or a promise?
Doesn't it say vow in the text? Verse 11, 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 11. What is it? How does it read there? Anyone have it? She made a vow. All right. The way that I would put this is that one who has an appreciation of the self-denying, self-sacrificing love of God, whose faith works by that love, then making a vow from that position of the new covenant is appropriate. That's how I would. It was not a self-centered, self-interest promise. Lord, if you do this for me, I'll give you that. Maybe I stated it earlier a little bit wrongly. It wasn't
to give the Lord her son. That would take more than a promise, I think.
That was a sacrifice.
Sacrifice.
That was a sacrifice. Yeah. So Hannah's prayer forever defines the genuine nature of a new covenant vow. She appreciates what it takes for God's promised covenant of salvation to be given forever to the world. It cost the life of God's own darling son, and she offers her son to God as a mirror image of God giving his son for her. She may or may not realize it, but she is a singular witness in a time of apostasy when Satan is accusing God that there is no one among his people who serves God because they appreciate his character of love. So she's over there praying, and while she's praying, the high priest is on his chair outside the temple, and he's looking at her, and what does he think?
She's drunk.
He thinks she's drunk. And Eli observes this woman's distress, but he displays no kindness at all. Eli takes more seriously the apparent drunkenness of a woman than the heinous crimes of his own sons. His protest is that she is not a worthless woman like Eli's scoundrels. This is a stinging rebuke to Eli, and yet done most politely. Verse 16, in disassociating herself from the behavior of his sons, she says, I'm not a worthless woman. She doesn't say, your sons are a bunch of scoundrels. They take women right into the church, and have their way. I'm not like that. She doesn't say that. But you know what? The thing about Eli, the priest, was he was obtuse. She could have said something very subtly and he would have never gotten it. Okay. And he doesn't even know what she's prayed for. But anyhow, Eli doesn't know what she's prayed for, but anyhow, he says, may you have the blessing of your prayer. May the Lord answer your prayer. He's off in La La Land. What? And here's the line here. She will eventually place her little cuckoo in Eli's nest, who will receive a vision in the night pronouncing the end of Eli's family. Hannah's little birdie that she put in Eli's nest was Samuel. And Samuel had a vision at night that Eli and his sons were going down, man. And God was going to put Samuel, in their place. And that's how God gets his vindication, through Hannah. Anyhow, it's just a beautiful story. Read it sometime. Online, I have my notes there back in the 2 quarters ago on Hannah. You might enjoy going back in the archives and reading it. And I think that Hannah is the female version of Abraham and Isaac.
Sounds like it, yeah. Thank you.